So the two-tier question is incredibly prescient. It means that we've now as a country got to decide whether we have concepts such as safeguarding vulnerability, basic needs, adequate accommodation that are purely and only applicable to recent arrivals to the United Kingdom, very often arrivals who are not here by any legal process that we know, whose identities are not known, and who clearly have, in some cases, criminal pasts or criminal intentions.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Michael Simmons. Now, Epping Forest District Council have won an injunction which means that the Bell Hotel can no longer be used to house asylum seekers. Now, to discuss that judgment, I'm joined today by the barrister Dr. Anna Loutfi and the editor of Spiked, Tom Slater. Now, Anna, can you take us through what this ruling said?
It's a really important ruling, I think. Let's just preface my summary of the judgment with a caveat that this is really a judgment about planning law and whether or not the landowners of the Bell Hotel in Epping, which is Somani Hotels Limited, whether they've breached planning control law. And that is a technical question. It's a technical question that relates to whether or not the hotel is now being used for something other than its original formal official listed use as a hotel, for example, as a hostel for hosting or accommodating asylum seekers. So the real technical question for the judge, Mr. Justice Ayres, is whether there's been a material change of use. Now, he can't decide that because this is an interim application that the claimant, who is Epping Forest District Council, made. That they're arguing that there's been a material change of use from a hotel to something else, call it a hostel if you will. He can't decide that on the basis of a preliminary or an interim application. What he has to do is decide whether or not they have some grounds for demanding interim relief, which in this case is the cessation of accommodation of asylum seekers at that particular hotel. And the factors that he'll be taking or has taken into consideration in making a favourable judgment on behalf of the claimant, Epping Council, the factors he's taken in are factors that I think the public, in their discussion of these protests recently outside the hotel, are very interested in, namely disruptions locally and the impact of housing asylum seekers on the lives of locals or residents, primarily concerned parents, because the hotel is within a walking distance of local amenities, including schools.
What's the key, the meaning of the ruling? What happens next? Does this go up to a higher court, or is it just a case that the asylum seekers now have to be removed from the hotel?
They have to be removed as of, I believe, September the 12th. Initially, I think Mr. Justice Ayres gave an order that no further asylum seekers would be housed there within 14 days of his judgment. And now that's an interim relief judgment. That means that the full facts, because these kinds of decisions are fact sensitive, will have to be reviewed and adjudicated upon as part of a final hearing. But in the interim period, there has been a cessation on the grounds that there are genuine concerns by residents, which have led to protests, and both the protests and the presence of the asylum seekers have had a detrimental effect on the local area. And one of the things that the judge said in this interim application is that there should have been some negotiation, because concerns have been raised by councillors and by residents, I believe, as early as 2020. When this process of adapting the hotel for asylum seekers first began, in the midst of a COVID crisis, when the hotel was losing business anyway, that conversion took place. The claimant described that as surreptitious and the abuse as flagrant. And the judge in this hearing said, well, we don't know how surreptitious it was or how flagrant any abuse has been, because we don't know that any abuse of law has actually transpired. But what we do know is that concerns were raised, and had the defendant hotel owner applied for planning permission, that would have been an opportunity for the concerns of residents to be what the judge called ventilated and addressed. And I think that's key.
And on that very point about local residents, if we can just turn to Tom. Anna's laid out there how the judge, mentioned residents, mentioned the protests. Today we've had Nigel Farage calling for peaceful protest up and down the country. Is this a sign that, actually the public will now be listened to and that protest works?
Well, I think that's the take-home message. It has to be. I mean, this hotel, as Anna was outlining there, has been used for housing asylum seekers since 2020, with some periods in which it wasn't. And yet it was only as soon as we've seen in recent weeks, thousands of people turning up outside the Bell demonstrating overwhelmingly peacefully, but with some unpleasant violence around the edges, that this has forced the issue, that you've seen the council really push this, and that also that it's become an issue of national importance. I think whilst we wait to see what will happen with this particular case, whether it is going to be firmly appealed, whether or not it's going to have kind of a knock-on impact for other hotels which are used for the same thing across the country, it's quite clear now that the public in these areas are not going to put up with this anymore. We're seeing these protests crop up everywhere. We're seeing them crop up, incidentally, not even just around asylum hotels. The protests recently in Waterlooville that were addressed by Suella Braverman, that relates to a block of flats that were going to be handed over for asylum applicants. And in general, what's become abundantly clear is that the public in these areas have noticed something that the government didn't really want them to notice, which is that our asylum system, because it's become so dysfunctional, has effectively become a kind of funnel for illegal migration, and quite a dangerous one at that. It does nothing to smear everyone who's in one of those hotels to suggest that people who are willing to enter a country illegally might be willing to commit other crimes. They might also be fleeing charges in other countries that they have left, or arriving from countries with not, shall we say, entirely enlightened views when it comes to women or sexual assault or what have you. So the public have noticed that now. They're not willing to put up with it. And I think the one thing that the government is now going to have to reckon with is that this is not just about the hotels either. All of these things are essentially downstream from the fact that the successive governments have lost control of the border. And until they get a grip on that, the unrest is going to continue, I think.
And Anna, a lot of the people that, are most concerned about how we house asylum seekers, a lot of the people that attend these protests, if you speak to them, they feel rightly or wrongly that we have sort of a two-tier justice system where their concerns are not listened to. Was any of this judgment a sort of counter to that, or is that reading too much into it? Is it purely about, planning law?
Now, the question of justice is really crucial. And of course, the judge had to take that on board when he was making his interim decision, because he has to decide whether or not the people's concerns, the local residents' concerns, had justice issues attached that in some sense did trump any counter arguments that the asylum seekers have rights that demand the conversion of this hotel into a temporary hostel. And in order to understand the justice element, what's really, really crucial is that if you look at the whole way in which this contract was set up, with the Home Office being the broker, and then on the other hand, you've got the hotel owners, Somali Hotel Group Limited, and you have some travel, as far as I can tell, some corporate travel management agency that has done a contract with the hotel owner in order to, and this is how it's been represented in the media, to allow the Home Office to meet its statutory obligations under the Immigration and Asylum Act 1999 to house asylum seekers. Well, I went to sections 94 and sections 95 of the Asylum Act 1999. And what it says is that the Secretary of State, quote, may provide or arrange for the provision of support for asylum seekers and their dependents who appear to be destitute. And the definition of destitute is basically that people have either no adequate accommodation, or if they do have adequate accommodation, they don't have essential or basic life needs met. Now, two things there. Firstly, there is no absolute duty on the Home Office to provide accommodation to asylum seekers. As you've heard, it's a discretionary duty. The Secretary of State may provide. And secondly, when we look at actually the definition of destitution as either people who lack accommodation that is adequate, or people who have accommodation that's adequate but lack some sort of basic social needs, that brings the justice question squarely into the foreground because, of course, there are plenty of people in this country who do not have adequate housing. There are plenty of people in this country who feel that their basic needs, their living needs, are not being met and can't be met. And they have no appeal like this to a discretionary power by the Secretary of State to house them. So you there have a two-tier assumption that asylum seekers will have an automatic right to have accommodation and their basic living needs met. And it's an interesting fact that when you go to the UK government website on asylum support contracts and the safeguarding framework that they've provided there, it's online, your audience can go and look it up. There is no reference whatsoever in the safeguarding framework to the safeguarding of persons such as the local residents of Epping. They don't factor because they don't count as vulnerable. And the category of vulnerability has now been repurposed by the Home Office to mean people who are adjusting to a new way of life in this country. That is the definition of vulnerability. And if they're adjusting to a new way of life, they're automatically vulnerable, and they will automatically have needs such as welfare needs, and I may add security needs. There is a permanent security presence at the hotel. There is a permanent welfare presence at the hotel. And all of the other functions of the hotel, including catering and cleaning and so on and so forth, reception, all of these have been repurposed, in the words of Mr. Justice Ayres, to serve one demographic and one demographic only. And he describes that demographic as single male asylum seekers. So the two-tier question is incredibly prescient. It means that we've now as a country got to decide whether we have concepts such as safeguarding, vulnerability, basic needs, adequate accommodation that are purely and only applicable to recent arrivals to the United Kingdom, very often arrivals who are not here by any legal process that we know, whose identities are not known, and who clearly have, in some cases, criminal pasts or criminal intentions. And the 3 arrests that I mentioned earlier are evidence of that. And those 3 arrests were taken extremely seriously by the judge in this application, because he said that the public, while he's aware that the application does concern itself primarily with technical questions of planning control, he cannot disregard, when looking at the balance of convenience and the justice question, he cannot disregard what he described as the public's legitimate fear of crime. And so I think in that sense, it is an incredibly important judgment. And of course, it has precedent implications, because there are these buildings being repurposed up and down the country, with residents all over the country feeling similarly to those of Epping. So yes, of course, a big question is what happens next? Where do those asylum seekers go? If not Epping, then where? What happens at other hotels? But I don't think this particular genie is going back into his bottle anytime soon.
And Tom, on that very point about what happens next, what does this mean for the government's asylum policy? You know, they've said that they want to close the hotels by the end of this parliament, but clearly there's going to be copycat legal challenges up and down the country. How can the government respond to this if they're not just going to send everybody home tomorrow?
No, absolutely. I mean, what we're in for really, excuse me, is essentially a game of whack-a-mole. I mean, even if they get entirely on top of the issue of hotels, these people have to go somewhere, or you need to look afresh at how we deal with the entire issue, which I think this government, because it is run, no offense, Anna, top to bottom by human rights lawyers, they are kind of constitutionally incapable of actually even going near questions of the Refugee Convention, even going near questions of the ECHR, even though you've got governments across Europe of both left-wing and right-wing persuasion who are starting to talk about, if at the very least, reform of various of those kinds of international commitments. But at the same time, this issue, they will have to confront it, because the public will not let them get away with it. The sense of injustice that surrounds this issue is really palpable. I've been to a few of these protests in a journalistic capacity, talking to people reporting, and that sense in which we have so many people in the country who are really struggling, and yet you've got people who arrived yesterday staying in these hotels. Epping, is, I think, in a way, is a little bit of a misnomer, because it's actually quite a prosperous area, kind of the sort of old, East End working class done good But we know that the issue of illegal migration, of housing asylum seekers, has been borne disproportionately by some incredibly impoverished places in the United Kingdom, places which have a lot of problems, places in which there are already scarce housing and resources and not a lot of prospects. And we also know that if you look at the analysis of last summer's horrific unrest, a key predictor for some of that horrendous violence that we saw was places that were kind of disproportionately bearing the brunt of the illegal migration issue. So whereas it's not obvious that this government has the answer, it's not obvious that any government has the full answer at this point, they are going to have to respond in one way, shape or form. And I think the key question as a country we've got to address is we need to carve out an asylum policy which is, yes, humane, but also sane. And we haven't got either of those two things at the moment, and the public have really recognised that.
Tom and Anna, thank you for joining us.